I noticed this one night sitting on the couch, way later than I meant to be up. Scrolling through nothing in particular. My phone buzzed with a charge notification, not a big one. Something small. I remember thinking, yeah, that makes sense, and then realizing I didn't actually know what it was for. I just knew it was normal. That's when it hit me how rarely I ever really opt out of things. Not in a dramatic way. I don't storm off or cancel my whole life. I just stay. I stay subscribed. I stay committed. I stay paying. And it's not because I'm excited about any of it. It's because opting out feels like work, like friction, like admitting something didn't pan out the way I thought it would. So I don't decide. I let things decide for me. And that felt uncomfortable in a way I hadn't really named before. Subscriptions are the easiest place to see it, at least for me. Streaming services, apps, random tools I signed up for during some motivated week that never came back. $8 here, $15 there, a couple at $20. None of them big enough to feel irresponsible on their own. I remember telling myself I'd cancel later, when I wasn't busy, when I had time to think. Months passed, then years. At one point, I actually listed them all out, just to see. It came out to around $90 a month, which doesn't sound insane until you say it out loud as a year. That's over $1,000 for things I mostly wasn't using. And the weird part was realizing I wasn't paying for content. I was paying to avoid the tiny discomfort of canceling, clicking a button, admitting I didn't need it anymore. That was the part I didn't really want to look at first. There were also the group things, the standing plans that just kind of happen every week without anyone ever redeciding them. The same dinner night, the same bar, the same split check that always lands a little higher than you expect. I remember a stretch where I wasn't even enjoying it that much anymore. I'd go home tired, a little irritated, wondering why my card balance kept shrinking faster than my mood. But opting out felt heavier than going. You don't want to be the one who breaks the rhythm. You don't want to explain yourself. So I framed it as being low maintenance, easy going. The kind of person who just goes with the flow. I didn't call it what it really was. Paying $30 or $40 a week to avoid a 5-second moment of awkwardness over a year that's close to $2,000. And I never once thought of it as a decision I was making. Delivery was another quiet one, especially on weeknights when everything already felt used up. Cooking felt like effort. Cleaning felt like future effort. Opening an app felt like relief. $10 extra in fees didn't register as $10. It registered as not having to think. I told myself it was just during busy weeks. Then busy weeks became most weeks. At some point, I did the math out of curiosity. 2 orders a week. About $12 in extra fees and tips each time. That's roughly $100 a month just for convenience. Over a year, that's $1,200 for not opting out of tiredness. And what stuck with me wasn't the number. It was realizing I never weighed that cost against anything. I just let exhaustion make the call, and my bank account quietly followed along. Upgrades were sneaky because they always came dressed as something reasonable. A slightly better seat, faster shipping, the larger size because it was only a few dollars more. I don't remember ever being excited about these things. I just remember not wanting to feel like the person who chose the worse option. There's a subtle pressure in that moment, like opting out of better is opting out of respectability. So I'd click yes without thinking. $5 here, $8 there. Multiply that by how often it happens in a month and a year, and it starts to look like real money, hundreds, sometimes more. And I never told myself I was buying joy or comfort. I told myself I was avoiding regret. That's what made it uncomfortable later, realizing I wasn't paying for improvement. I was paying to not feel cheap for 10 seconds. Credit cards have their own version of this. The minimum payment feels like a gift, a little permission slip that says, you can stop thinking now. I used to see it as being responsible. I paid on time, I wasn't late, I wasn't reckless. But when I finally looked at a statement over a few years, the interest line told a different story. Thousands of dollars paid and nothing to show for it. No object, no memory, just time. Opting out of discomfort each month kept the balance alive. And the weird thing is I didn't feel irresponsible while it was happening. I felt normal. That's what stuck with me. How easy it was to mistake avoidance for stability, and how expensive that confusion turned out to be. I stayed in an apartment longer than I probably needed to, mostly because moving felt like a whole thing. Boxes, paperwork, uncertainty. The rent crept up a little each year, nothing dramatic enough to trigger panic. It was still within range of whatever that meant at the time. So I stayed. I told myself stability was worth paying for. And maybe it was, for a while. But at some point, I realized the extra $200 a month I was paying, compared to similar places nearby, added up to over $2,000 a year. I wasn't paying for comfort anymore. I was paying to not disrupt my routine. Opting out would have meant admitting that staying put wasn't the smart, grown-up move I'd framed it as. That realization sat heavier than the number, because it meant I hadn't really chosen stability. I just avoided the hassle of change. The gym membership was more emotional than financial, which almost made it worse. I liked the idea of being someone who went. Canceling felt like giving up on that version of myself. So I kept paying, month after month, $45, quietly gone. I'd go once or twice, feel good about it, then disappear again. After a year, that's over $500. After a few years, it's real money. But the weight wasn't in the total. It was in the realization that I was using money as a placeholder for intention. As long as I was paying, I could pretend I was still trying. Opting out would have forced a more honest conversation with myself. And honesty, it turns out, has its own kind of cost. Family stuff was harder to see clearly because it never felt optional. Holidays got a little bigger every year. Gifts crept up in price. Travel costs quietly normalized. I don't remember anyone ever sitting down and deciding this was the new number. It just became the number. And opting out felt loaded. Like you were saying something about your priorities or your gratitude or your place in the whole thing. So I absorbed it. A few hundred here, a plane ticket there. Over 10 years, that's not small money. But it never felt like spending. It felt like keeping the peace. What made me uneasy later was realizing I never checked whether these traditions still fit my life financially. I just assumed they did because questioning them felt heavier than the cost itself. Workdays had their own quiet autopilot. Coffee on the way in. Lunch grabbed without thinking. Parking fees I stopped noticing because they happened every day. None of it felt indulgent. It felt functional, necessary. But when I finally added it up, it surprised me. $8 here, $12 there, $200 a month without really trying. That's over $2,000 a year just to keep the day moving smoothly. And I remember thinking, I don't even enjoy half of this. I just don't want friction in the middle of a long day. Opting out would have meant planning, preparing, maybe feeling slightly out of sync with everyone else. So I paid instead. And the uncomfortable part wasn't the total. It was realizing how often necessary was just another word for unexamined. There were all the little protections I kept just in case. Extended warranties, extra coverage, add-ons that promised peace of mind for a few more dollars a month. None of them felt irresponsible. In fact, they felt smart. Like I was being cautious. But when I looked back, most of them never did anything. Years went by without a claim, without a call, without a moment where I thought, good thing I had that. I was paying for a feeling, not a service. And opting out felt risky in a vague, undefined way, like tempting fate. So I stayed enrolled, $20 here, $15 there, a few hundred a year. The weight wasn't in the math. It was in realizing how fear had quietly put itself on a payment plan. Splitting checks with friends was another one I never questioned. Someone suggests just dividing it evenly, and I nod along. Even if I ordered less, even if I skipped drinks, it's easier, cleaner, fair in a social sense, even if not in a mathematical one. I told myself it didn't matter, and once it didn't. But over time, those extra $10 or $15 stacked up, hundreds over a year. And what bothered me wasn't the money. It was how automatically I paid to keep things smooth. Opting out would have meant doing math at the table, being that guy. So I absorbed it quietly. And later, alone, I wondered how many times I'd paid just to avoid a moment of mild tension. Phones were supposed to last longer than they do. At least that's what I used to think. But every couple of years, something would slow down or crack, or feel slightly behind, and suddenly upgrading felt normal. Expected. I don't remember ever being unhappy with my old phone before the idea of a new one entered the room. But opting out felt like falling behind the pace of normal life. So I'd upgrade. $800 spread out over payments that didn't feel real in the moment. Do that 5 times, and it's $4,000. And what stuck with me was how I never asked what I was gaining. I just didn't want to be the one holding on too long. There were habits I stuck with because quitting would have made the past spending feel wasted. Classes I stopped enjoying. Services I barely used. I told myself I'd already paid, so I might as well keep going. Which sounds logical until you realize it means paying even more to protect a decision that already didn't work. I doubled down instead of stepping away, month after month. The uncomfortable part came when I noticed how stubborn that was. How much money I spent just to avoid admitting something wasn't worth it anymore. Opting out would have meant letting the loss be a loss, and that felt heavier than extending it. Some subscriptions weren't about use at all. They were about who I used to be. Music platforms tied to a phase of my life. Brands I felt loyal to out of habit. Canceling them felt like closing a chapter I wasn't ready to let go of. So I paid to keep the door cracked open. $10 a month doesn't feel like nostalgia, but $10 a month for 5 years is $600 for something I barely touched. What sat with me was realizing how memory had a monthly fee and how often I paid it without noticing. Fees were the background noise of my finances. ATM fees, late fees, convenience fees, small enough to ignore, annoying enough to accept. I told myself they weren't worth the energy. But one afternoon I added them up, not out of discipline, out of curiosity. It was more than I expected. A few $100s in a year. Money that vanished without a single benefit attached. And that's when it hit me that opting out of paying attention was the most expensive option. I didn't lose that money all at once. I let it leak out while I wasn't looking. Social obligations carried their own quiet price tag. Birthdays, showers, group gifts, dinners that weren't really optional. None of it felt excessive on its own, but it was constant, and I never planned for it. I just reacted. Opting out felt selfish, like I was shrinking my circle, so I said yes, again and again. What unsettled me later was realizing how much of my budget was already spoken for by expectations I'd never agreed to out loud. I wasn't generous with intention. I was generous by default. And default generosity doesn't check balances. There were things I did simply because everyone else was doing them, ordering in, upgrading, spending a little extra to keep pace. It never felt reckless because it was shared, normal. But normal doesn't mean cheap. When I finally looked at how much of my spending came from imitation rather than desire, it was uncomfortable. I hadn't chosen most of it. I just followed along. Opting out would have meant feeling slightly out of sync, so I paid instead. And the realization that belonging had a line item attached to it stayed with me longer than I expected. The hardest part wasn't any single category. It was seeing how passive I'd been overall. How rarely I stopped and said, "Do I still want this?" I liked thinking of myself as intentional, thoughtful. But the numbers told a quieter story. A story of momentum, of staying put, of letting things continue because stopping felt awkward or tiring. Accepting that no one forced these expenses on me was heavier than the totals themselves, because it meant the cost of never opting out wasn't just financial. It was the slow realization that I'd been drifting. Some nights now, I sit in the same spot on the couch, phone in my hand, and I notice the charges differently. Not with panic, just awareness. Nothing blew up, nothing collapsed. It was just a long trail of small non-decisions, stretching back years. I think about how opting out was always available, just socially and emotionally expensive, and how I paid instead, over and over without ever feeling like I was choosing to. I'm still noticing it, still catching myself mid-yes, still uncomfortable in that pause. And sometimes I wonder how much lighter things might have felt if I'd paid attention earlier.